Hi and welcome to this video. You might have seen my first part where we built this tiny app, or where we actually had this tiny app here and moved it from Redux to the React Context API. But we used classes, and isn't using classes so 2018? Well, let's do it the 2019 way, and let's convert this to use React hooks and functional components everywhere. So for this, we'll need to know what React hooks are, obviously. And I created a video and an article, which you should definitely check out, and to which you find links in the video description, where you can learn the most important things about React hooks from scratch. No prior knowledge about it needed. So I do assume that you know what React hooks are for this video. So how can we use hooks here then? We got classes everywhere, like here in the global state, in the app component here, and also in our cart and products pages. Everywhere we got components. Time to change this. Now let's start in the app.js file, and let's convert this component here, this class-based component, into a functional component. And for this, I'll create a constant and name it app, which will be an arrow function that receives props and that does not have a render method here, but just a return statement that returns some JSX. And converting this component here was fairly trivial because there's nothing in here which would make that complex. We can now get rid of that component import up there. Now, that was simple. Let's move on to the products.js file. And here I'll do the same. I'll name this products page, and this will now be a functional component that simply gets some props, as all functional components, and that has no render method, of course. So let's get rid of this. And with that changed, we can get rid of that component import. And yeah, that is it already. That is it. Nothing too fancy here. I'm using shop context consumer in a way that worked in functional components all the time, so even before React hooks were added, and therefore no adjustments are required here. Now that differs in the cart.js file. Here we got component did mount, though I'm only doing some logging here, but more importantly, we're getting access to the context with the static context type here, and that is not supported in functional components. So let me name this cart page here, and again, it's a function that receives props, and that will have no render method, and therefore let's get rid of render. But the problem is component did mount and this static context type. This will not work. So here we need hooks, and we actually need two hooks here. The more important hook for the context, which we are really using here, is useContext. This gives us access to context in a functional component. The less important hook which we need here, because we're not really doing anything useful with it, is useEffect, which allows us to replace component did mount. Now let's start with the context. Here we can create a new constant and name it context. The name is up to you. And then you call useContext, and as an argument, you pass a reference to your context. So shop context in this application here, which we import from context shop context. And in case you're wondering what the shop context is about and what this entire app is about, of course, watch part 1 of this video where we do that Redux to context API transformation. So now we're getting access to context here. We can therefore console log context here, but not in component did mount. But instead we can use useEffect here. And useEffect, as you know, takes a function as an argument, which will execute right after every render cycle, essentially. Now, I don't want to log the context as often. I only want to log it when this component renders for the first time when it was mounted. And for that, you can pass that second argument to useEffect, which is an array of all the dependencies of this function. And only if one of the dependencies changes, this will rerun. Now, obviously, we got no dependencies in here, right? So this is an empty array. And this is interpreted by React such that it will basically never rerun this function here. It will only run it once when this component mounts. With that, we got access to context. We hopefully logged that to the console. Now, all the places where I access this context down there, of course, now have to be converted to just context without this, because context is now just a constant in this function. But with that, we should have everything we need. And if we now go to our app here and we go to the cart, we see our context here. We see what's in there. And if I add something to the cart, this still works, even though I haven't converted everything to functional and hooks-based components. But that's the great thing about React hooks. You can just dump them into an existing project as long as you're using React 16.8. And it doesn't matter if some of your components use classes and other use hooks and are functional. They work seamlessly together. But with that, let's tackle our biggest functional class-based component. That is the global state, where I do that entire state management with my context API. In there, I now want to have a functional component which receives props, obviously. And that means that we'll have problems with the state here, because state management with this state property and with this set state is not supported in functional components. It never was, and it isn't with hooks. Now, we can simply use the useState hook for that. So we import useState instead of component, and that starts here. Instead of having state as a property like this, we can add a constant here, and we'll use array destructuring in a second, and we'll pass this object here to useState. Now, the array destructuring here allows us to get access to the current state, which is then updated whenever we change it, and a function that allows us to update the state. And we always get back these two elements here by useState. We always get back an array with these two elements. Now, the cool thing is we don't have to stick to one state. We can actually have 2 or 3 or as many as you need states. And here it would make sense to manage the cart and the product separately. Because unlike this set state with class-based components, when you update your state here with the help of useState, React is not merging your update with the old state. It will overwrite it. And therefore, if you have something which doesn't always update together, like products and cart, it makes sense to use different states. So here I'll use another state, which will just be an array for my cart. And actually, this products state here can therefore also just be the array. It doesn't have to be an object. Here, I'll name this products and set products. And here, I'll name this cart and set cart, because the second element always is that function that allows us to set the new state. And both states here are simply arrays now. Now, I actually don't even have to manage products here as a state, because in this tiny application, there is no logic that would change the products. So therefore, this doesn't even have to be state. We can just have a products array here like this, and this will do. We don't have to use state here. For the cart, however, we do, because the cart will change. So let's also get rid of that render method down there and just return JSX. And now, how do we use our new cart state then? Well, first of all, things like add product to cart can stay there. We can define functions and functions, but we have to store them as functions, either with the function keyword or here with const or let. So we create a variable or a constant that then holds this function. So now this allows us to add functions in that functional component, which is great. But inside of these functions, inside of add product to cart and of remove product from cart, we're still using the state incorrectly. Instead of this state cart, we just have, well, cart, right? This here, this constant, which we use here or which we get here with array destructuring. This is our cart. And here, this can all stay the way it is. When we call setState and update the cart, however, we want to call setCart and pass our updated cart in there. And that is all. This should be all we need to do on this first add product to cart functions. Easy as that. Now for remove product from cart, it's essentially the same. Instead of this state cart, we just copy the cart, because that is that current cart array as set and updated by setCart and by useState, where we initialize it. And then down there, we change all kinds of stuff. And in the end, when we set state, we set cart to the updated cart again. So really straightforward and simple. Now the products are just products now. They're not even managed with useState, but here it doesn't matter if it is a normal constant which is not generated by useState, or if it was generated by useState. We just use the constant here. Therefore, it's the same for the cart. This is also a constant now. It's this constant. This here is the products constant. And for the methods or the functions, well, we remove the this keyword and we just call add product to cart or remove product from cart here. So these constant functions I defined up here. And that is almost all. Instead of this props children, it should just be props children. And therefore now if we save this, we should be able to still add stuff to the cart and do it there and also remove it from the cart. This works just fine, and it works as it did before, but now with functional components and our hooks. Now, we're not done yet though. This is of course a nice transformation. Just a quick check, this here was a functional component. So we're only using functional components now, which is great. But instead of using useState here, which is perfectly fine in the global state, we can also have a look at another hook provided by React, and that would be the useReducer hook. Now, the useReducer hook is also a hook related to state management, but it allows us to create a more complex reducer function that receives the old state and an action and spits out a new state. And in the end, that allows us to manage this add product to cart and remove product from cart logic in a bit of a more elegant way and to outsource it away from our component here, even if we want to. For this, I'll create a new file here, which I'll name reducers.js, which is totally optional. You don't have to create that new file here. And in reducers.js, I want to basically have my functions in there. So I'll copy them in there, though we'll have to adjust them, of course, because we're using things here which are only available in our global state component and not in every random file where we add them to. Now I want to use these functions here in a reducer function which I create. So I'll create yet another new function here, and I'll name this, or I'll export this as a default here. Export default shop reducer, and that is a function in the end that will get a state and an action and then should return something. Let's actually export this as a named export to make this really clear. So here, I get a state and an action, and this will be a function that we can later use with useReducer. Now, I will first of all check which type of action we have. So I expect the action to be a JavaScript object that has a type property that defines which action we're executing here. And this, again, is basically a logic you might know from Redux, where we also have actions with a type. So here I switch on the action type, and I check my different cases. And let's say here, I define my cases up there. So I export constants, and the first one could be add product, which in the end just holds that string here as an identifier. And then we have remove product here, which holds this string as an identifier. So we have these two constants here, which we can use as action types, and I'm just storing them in separate constants so that we can simply import and use them everywhere, and we can't mistype on the string identifier. And here, I therefore check for add product, and if that is the case, I return a certain state. If we have another case, namely remove product, I will return yet another state, and in a default case, so that we have some other actions, I simply return the state as we get it, so untouched basically. Now, in add product, I of course want to return the state as it is spit out by add product here. So I want to call that function here. And that function requires a product as an input, but this function will also require cart as an input, the old cart. So what I will do down there is I will return add product to cart. And for the product that I need to pass in, I expect that to be part of my action. That action just needs to have a product, because how could I add a product that I don't get? So this is a reasonable requirement. The cart is part of my existing state, because this reducer will be used for managing the cart. And therefore, the state will have a cart property, let's say. Or the state itself is our cart. That could also be a reasonable assumption. So state is our cart array. We could go with that as well. But to make this a bit clearer, I'll say start has a cart property. So state is an object which has a cart property, which in turn is an array. So I passed it into add product to cart, and in add product to cart, we're then duplicating our cart array here to not mutate the old array in the old state object. We're then finding the item we want to update. We're then doing all the updating logic. And in the end here, that's the important thing. I will not call setCart or setTimeout even here. I will just return my updated cart here. Or, to be precise, since I return add product to cart here, and I need to return a new state here, and we just defined that state should be an object that has a cart property, what I actually return up here is not the updated cart, but an object that has the cart property where I do actually get my updated cart or assign my updated cart. Now, if your state object has more data than just the cart, then you maybe want to pass the state into add product to cart, so that here we get state instead of cart, so that where I want to use the cart, I have to access state cart like this, and then down there, I can copy all other state properties first, and then only override the cart property. So that would be the right strategy if your state is an object with multiple properties, and this reducer function only changes one of them, so that you don't lose the others. Now we're returning this here in the case of add product to cart. Now when we're removing a product from cart, I want to call remove product from cart here. And I need to pass in my product ID, which I expect to get on my action, let's say. So action product ID could be what I pass on. And I also pass on my state here as an extra argument, because in remove product from cart, I also expect to get that product ID and that state, so that in there I can get my current cart with the same strategy as when we add an item to the cart. Then we do all the updating logic as before and as explained in part 1 of this mini series or of this 2 video series. But then here at the bottom, I'm also not setting anything. Instead, I'm just returning a copy of the old state, and I override the cart with the updated cart, just like this. And now with that, we have our reducer function here, which we export. We're also exporting our actions up there, and we can now use this here in global state and other parts of the application if we want to. Now let's use it here in global state. We got our context here where I bind add product to cart and remove product from cart, and now I want to use my reducer function. For this, instead of using useState like this, so let me comment this out, I use useReducer, and I need to pass in my reducer function here, and I will get something back for that. Now let's first of all import the reducer function. So let's import something from, and that would be the reducers file. So from there, I want to import my shop reducer, and that shop reducer is the function I want to pass to useReducer here. And what I get back is the state, so the state managed by that reducer. We could also name this cart state if you want to. Remember, I simply changed the logic so that state here is actually an object with a cart property, and therefore we should use it as such here in global state. And the second element we get here in this array returned by useReducer is a dispatch method, which allows us to dispatch a new action object that reaches that reducer function and then hopefully triggers something there. So that is that action that is received here by the reducer function. We control what this is because we dispatch it. Now therefore in here in global state, we can get rid of all that logic here in front of setTimeout. I will leave setTimeout here though. And the same for removing items, because that is now handled in the reducer. And now instead of setting the cart here or setting some state directly, I'll comment this out. And instead now I will dispatch. And now I need an action from a reducers file. So I will import both actions because eventually I will need both. Add product and remove product. So these two action identifiers. And now we don't just dispatch add product. Instead, our action has to be a JavaScript object, because in our reducer function, we are expecting that action has a type property and a product, or in the case of removing, a product ID property. And hence, in the global state here, iDispatch type add product. That is our identifier we're looking for. And then product, which is the product I'm getting here. And the same logic applies down there. Here I dispatch a JavaScript object with a type of remove product. And here we need to forward our product ID. So let's do that. And now we just have to make sure that we use the cart state object here. So in the place where we just used cart, we use cartState.cart now. That is all, and this should now use useReducer in conjunction with the context API. So if we now go back, we get an error. Do you know why? Well, we get an error because whilst everything I said is basically how it works, we got one flaw in this application. And that is, well, the moment where our app loads, we have no initial state anymore, right? We have our products, but that is not related to the cart. For the cart here, we have our reducer here, and that essentially returns our default state initially, and we have no default state here. So this is just undefined. What we can do to fix this is in the place where we call useReducer, you can pass in an initial state as a second argument. And here this could be an object with the cart key, which is an empty array initially. And now with that, we ensure that this is not undefined, but actually an object that fits our cart state structure. And therefore now this reloads and it works. And if I go to products and I start adding items, you see this updates correctly here. We see our items here in the cart, and we can also remove them from there with that slight delay added by setTimeout. And this is how you can use the context API with hooks, with either useState, as I did it in the first part of this video, or with the help of useReducer to get even closer to that Redux experience, where you also add reducer functions, of course. And ultimately, it's of course up to you which style you prefer. The advantage of the reducer approach, of course, is that you can have more complex state-changing logic that you outsource so that you don't bloat your component too much here. But ultimately, that is up to you. Of course, the same restrictions and thoughts as I shared them at the end of the first video still apply. So should you use Context API over Redux? Have a look at my first video and there at my summary at the end to hear my thoughts on that. That does not change by the fact that you're now using hooks, because the reasons I named there still are all there. They're not eradicated by hooks. I hope this was helpful, and I hope I see you in other videos too. Bye.